In this episode, I talk with the one and the only Dr. Scot McKnight. Scott is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He's a well known scholar and prolific author of many books, such as The King Jesus Gospel, The Blue Parakeet, Reading Romans Backwards, as well as many others. In this conversation, we talk about his latest book, which he co authored with Cody Matchett. It's called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. We talk about a range of issues associated with Revelation, such as its background cultural context. We chat also about the way it employs concepts like divine wrath, and we look at the way it compares to, say, Paul's letter to Romans, another book of the New Testament. And importantly, we discuss how the church can apply the message of Revelation in today's world. As always, I pray this episode is a blessing to you. I hope it offers a lot of food for thought. I pray that it challenges you and gives you something to prayerfully reflect on and to consider as you seek to be a follower of the Lamb. Well, Scott, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I appreciate your time, and I'm excited to chat about your new book, Revelation for the Rest of Us.
Well, thanks, Matt. It's good to be with you and to meet you. And maybe we can join hands on how eschatology in the Bible needs to work better.
Absolutely. I think we're kindred spirits on most, if not all of these things. So I look forward to the conversation. I recently finished your book. Here it is, Revelation for the Rest of Us. I highly recommend everybody go pick it up. Actually, I think it's the last line of the whole book. Well, I know you have a liking for starting at the end and reading things backwards. So, and so at the very end, the afterwards, I think it's the last sentence. Pretty sure. I love it. It says, "This is not a commentary on Revelation. It is rather a theology of political discipleship rooted in Revelation and how best to read it." And I love that. I think that sums up your book. I think it sums up the last book of the New Testament. But I'd like to just jump right in if we could. A theology of political discipleship. If there are two words that seldom come together, and that two things that we are supposed to never talk about in public: politics and religion. Let's talk about politics and religion. So, political discipleship. How does Revelation teach us that?
Well, let's start with the reality that the 70%, let's just say that is an accurate number, of evangelicals in the United States have aligned themselves with the Republican Party, which has put them in positions in churches where they cannot speak against a Republican candidate, even if he is Donald Trump. All right. And speaking against Joe Biden or Barack Obama is completely legitimate. It doesn't matter what they say, they can be wrong. How did we get ourselves in a position where the evangelical church is so aligned with one political party that if you make a positive statement about a Democrat president, you are suddenly, people are wondering if you're true to the faith? And I've had this happen to me, and I make it really clear on my public posts, and I've been blogging for 20 years, that I do not align with any political party. So I think that it is because we have not developed a prophetic capacity to speak into the political spheres. And I believe that that is caused by failures to read prophetic literature in the Bible accurately. I'm talking about the Old Testament prophets who never stopped critiquing the powers in Jerusalem. You know, not just Moab and Edom and Egypt, etc., and Babylon, etc. They were constantly critiquing the powers. Jesus critiqued the powers of Jerusalem. And the book of Revelation is, I would be willing to call it, a discipleship manual, teaching Christians how to evaluate Rome, which is called Babylon in the book of Revelation, according to moral and, let's say, spiritual and ethical and prophetic categories, to make Christians dissidents in Rome, in the Roman Empire, and to be able to be people who resist the ways of Babylon and the ways of Rome. Because we have failed to read the prophetic literature as anything other than predictions of what's going to happen and who in the modern world, Putin, fulfills what category, the beast of the earth or the beast from the sea. That's how people read prophetic literature, as predictions of what's going to happen in the near future. So Netanyahu seizing control with a coalition right now becomes for them fodder for predicting whether something is occurring from the book of Revelation or Ezekiel and Gog and Magog and all this stuff. Instead of discerning how the powers of this world use their powers to exploit rather than to do good, we have failed to become the kinds of theo-political disciples that we need to be in the world. That's a long answer, but we're professors, so that's what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned Revelation as a prophetic book. And I think that's where things go south real quick for a lot of people, especially evangelicals, who want to see Revelation as sort of a cosmic calendar, a play-by-play of the future and that sort of thing. But let's talk about prophecy a little bit. Do you think? Well, let's just back up. Why do evangelicals and many Christians in our context see prophecy as strictly prediction? You know, when you think prophet, we think Nostradamus, crystal ball, future, and yeah, Revelation calls itself a prophecy, but you're saying that it is not, strictly speaking, future prediction, right?
Yeah, I mean, why do they do this? I'm not quite sure I can answer that question. That's a big one. I would say they have a habit of reading prophetic literature as prediction, in part because so many cool things happen in the life of Jesus to fulfill prophetic dimensions that they've sort of developed this mentality that a prophet is someone who predicts.
Mm-hmm.
In the Old Testament, a prophet is someone who is inspired by God, who, given a vision by God, is able to communicate to the people of God the significance of what's going on in their country at that time in a moral, spiritual, covenantal way. And when they don't stack up, they become critical of the government. So they become political columnists, as it were. And then they render judgment on the basis of what God is like, of what God is going to do to that country, Israel, Judah, if they do not live according to the covenant. And so they tend to be evaluators of the current situation and predict coming judgment or coming redemption if the people will turn from their sinful ways and then turn back to God. That's the general drift of prophetic literature. It is not simply to predict what's going to happen. It is to discern a current situation and then say, this is how God looks at it. And if you repent, the judgment is not going to come. If you don't repent, judgment is going to come. So, and Jesus fits right into that category.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think I tell my students all the time, if you want to know how to read prophetic literature, pay attention to how the New Testament authors read prophetic literature. They're interacting with the Old Testament all the time. And I always go back to what is it, that text, Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, where Matthew is providing a little commentary of sorts on why Jesus and the Holy Family leave Egypt and come back home. And he says, this is to fulfill what the prophet said. And he's quoting Hosea chapter 11. And you go back and you look at that context, and nowhere in that section is Hosea predicting anything. In fact, he's reflecting on the past, the Exodus, and saying, out of Egypt I called my son. And Matthew takes that and says this fulfills Jesus' story in a sense, because Jesus is the new Israel and that kind of thing. And so strictly speaking, prophecy is not just prediction fulfillment. There's something more more present about it and in reality of with respect to using it, I guess. And Revelation, what do they say? Revelation alludes to the Old Testament hundreds of times, over 400 times or something like that.
Yeah, it
Do you
depends who you ask, but I think Greg Beale,
Yeah,
didn't he
bit
have
more than that. Yeah,
like 600 at times? Yeah, he said.
quite a bit. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what do you think John's why do you think that is? I mean, John reports to have a vision, and all of these visions, are written down. Um, how do you navigate that? I know you talk a little bit about this in the book, but how do you navigate that? Does John see things, or is he drawing from the Old Testament, or is that a false dilemma? Is it both? In terms of the
Yeah.
text, what would you say?
Well, I wrote to Richard Bauckham and I wrote to John Goldingay on the same day and asked these questions.
Oh, good. What'd they say?
And especially Bauckham, I think, has done amazing work on the book of Revelation, but so has Goldingay because he works with the prophets. John had a vision. He had visions. I totally believe that he got lost in some kind of ecstatic world of some level.
Hmm.
But when you see things in those worlds, you have to choose language to define or to describe it. And then when you sit down later to write this out, so John saw things, and when John what he saw, he interpreted in light of what he knew, and what he knew was Old Testament prophetic language. And when he sat down to write it, he wrote it up in ways that sounded like Old Testament prophetic literature. And yet, how many times does John actually quote the Old Testament? It's rare. But his language, it's like the book of James, which sounds like Jesus in every paragraph, but he only quotes Jesus once at the end. It's a rather innocuous quotation,
Mm-hmm.
don't make about vows. It's odd. Because he sounds so much like Jesus, but doesn't quote him. John sounds like all the prophets. So I think John's visions are connected to imagination in the biggest sense of the word. And that John then, when he wrote it out, had no language to describe what he saw other than prophetic literature, but he didn't see these things as fulfillments of that language, but this is the way to talk about what he saw. So that's how I would say. I would say, just like Matthew,
Yeah.
he knows the Bible so well. He's so soaked in Scripture that when he starts describing things, he sounds like the Bible.
And I suspect that's probably what part of the problem is today. People just run to Revelation without any of the background, any of the Old Testament roaming around in their minds. It's almost like Revelation gets interpreted within a vacuum, because most people don't know the Old Testament. They certainly don't know the
Yeah.
prophets. They don't know the message
Yeah.
of any of the prophets, really, it seems, these days. And yet they want to interpret Revelation. And I don't know. Eugene Peterson, didn't he make a rule or come up with something to that effect in his Reverse Thunder book? He said, you're not allowed to read Revelation until you've read the whole Bible. And I think that's helpful, don't you think?
Well, that book of his,
Yeah.
there are some chapters in there that are just stunning because I think of his sensitivity to language.
Yeah.
And I found and his sensitivity to imagination, to
Mhm.
poetry, made him a particularly skilled interpreter of the book of Revelation. Not every chapter is really good, but most of them, I think his early parts are really good in that book. And I think that that's exactly right, is that you can't read Revelation without knowing the prophets to see what they're doing. But I get really nervous, even with people like Greg Beale, who when they see an Old Testament text, at least pretty clear, they think it's at least an echo of, say, this in Ezekiel, that they think that they study the context, they'll see it as a prediction. And I think it's a man whose mind is so, John, that is, so swamped and soaked in the prophetic literature that he cannot write in any way that doesn't bring up that language. So
Yeah. And you're in your book, I can't quite remember where, but you want to take us back to the original kind of situation. I mean, you point your reader back at times to that. Of course, your book is also very applicable to today, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the world of the first century in Asia Minor, um, is much different than the world today in some respects, and yet there's a lot of similarities as well. But just the contexts are completely different. We live in a technological, scientific age. How do you bridge the gap? I mean, do you have what principles would you offer to listeners in helping them to bridge the gap between the first century context and the modern context?
I have a principle that I learned when I was a sophomore in college in reading a German by the name of Johann von Goethe. And he said in German, "Willst ein Dichter du verstehen, musst in Dichters Lande gehen." And that could be translated pretty simplistically as, if you want to understand a poet, you have to go to a poet's land. And so I believe that we have to read the book of Revelation in a way that makes us feel like we're in the first century, and limited to first century information that we have appropriated in our minds or that we have access to. And a lot of people don't have that ability or that time or that expertise. And they are the ones who are particularly, in my opinion, dangerous in reading the book of Revelation. And, there's some pretty well-known pastors who don't believe in doing background studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
To quote Roger Olson, one of my friends, there's a certain pastor in Minnesota with a large ministry outside of Minnesota. So to me, I think we have to try to get back in that first century as much as we can. And I don't know if you've been to Ephesus. Have you been to Ephesus?
I have not. I want to go. I need to go.
Yes. Well, when I was your age, I was coaching my son's baseball teams, and I didn't have time to do this in the summer. And I will never give up the baseball days I had with my son.
Absolutely.
But you cannot walk down the main Cardo, the main street in Ephesus, and see what's called the terrace houses at the bottom, that library that is so cool. It was not there in the first century. And look out on the forum and out on the sea and look over the hills and realize the massive size of Ephesus, and see the temple of there's not much of Artemis left, but at least we can read about it and reconstruct it. And then all of a sudden say, this is one of the churches. And then you go to Pergamum and you realize the profundity of that city's at that time. Sardis, there's stuff there that's not all first century. Laodicea is Hierapolis, there's pretty cool stuff there. Colossae is nothing but a hill. And you get into that world and try to read about it and study it. And then ask yourself the questions all the time when you're reading these texts. How would the people of the first century have heard this and seen this? Mm-hmm. That's what we have to do by way of imagination and sort of adductive reasoning. We've got to try to figure out what this would have meant in that world as much as possible. And you know this as well. There's so much scholarship on this stuff.
Yeah.
Richard Bauckham, David Awney, they have massive studies on this, on the background. And it's irresponsible today not to know some of this stuff if we're actually making a big deal. Now, Cody Matchett and I, my co-author, we chose to stay out of the weeds as much as possible so that the big, simpler message could come through. Every one of these passages in the book of Revelation deserves careful explanation, and all of it is connected to the first century and to the Jewish world and to the Western Asia Minor and to the Roman Empire, and we need to explore these sorts of things. And then I think this is the principle that I've used in teaching for many years is John spoke in John's way in John's day, as Jesus spoke in Jesus's way in Jesus's day, as Isaiah spoke. And as we realize this, that God speaks his word through agents, human agents in the world for their day. We have to see how they operate and then see if we can be continuous with that and carry that on in our world.
Mhm.
And I believe that's the secret to reading a text in the first century and bringing it into our world. And I'm sure
Yeah.
you do the same thing. And if you don't, I'd say you should.
Oh, I do. In fact, I
Yeah,
tell people, I mean, this is Revelation 101. Revelation is not a book, it's a letter, it's an epistle. And as soon as you start saying that it's a letter, is the minute you have to start digging into the historical background, because letters imply situations, right? And this is a first
yeah.
century letter, so you have to dig into the first century situation. And
Well,
there's no, yeah, go
Jeff
ahead.
Wyma. Do you know Jeff Wyma?
I don't, huh?
He's a Pauline scholar. He writes on letters.
Okay. Oh, okay.
He has a brand new book. It's really worth reading. And he
What is
kind
it?
of
What's the
it's
book?
I don't know what it's called. I don't
I'll
remember
look it
book
up. Yeah.
titles. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got a brand new. It's on the seven churches,
Okay.
and he doesn't think they're actually letters. And he's one of the
Hmm.
world's best people. But he calls them messages. It doesn't quite fit a letter format, but it is. It is what I mean.
Sure. Sure.
I would say they're messages, they're letters, but at the same time, they are like to the church of Ephesus. That is about that situation right then.
Sure. Yeah.
And that context clarifies it. And they would have heard this book read aloud in their house churches in Ephesus, however many there were. And I often wonder if maybe they just didn't read the letter to the other churches. They just read the letter to Ephesus and then read the whole letter. So the whole letter applied to them,
Right.
but they weren't worried about Smyrna and Pergamum. They were
Mhm.
worried about Ephesus. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, that's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. I mean, I think the point is, well, look, I grew up thinking, like I said earlier, Revelation's like this timetable. It's a play by
yeah,
play of what's going to happen. I never once knew that it was a situational message or letter, or whatever you want to
yeah,
call it.
yeah,
I never
yeah,
knew that. And so as soon as if you don't know that, then it makes no sense to dive
yeah,
into this,
yeah,
do the historical background work. There's like zero reason to do that, because it's a prophecy, hence Nostradamus, hence future, has no relevance to the first century, right? And
yeah.
of course, and you're familiar with this, there are many folks out there who have promoted, gosh, that horrible idea of the each church represents an era of the church, in
I
history.
grew up with that. My dad taught me this when I
It's
was
it's been
in high
everywhere,
school.
man. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. That's literally how I understood Revelation for many years growing up. And yeah, there's so many problems with that, of course.
and we're in the Church of Laodicea.
Yeah.
It was very convenient that we're the ones who perceive it. Everybody else is going to hell. That
Yeah.
was what I kind of grew up with, and
Right. Right.
yeah, that's. I mean, how long did it take you
Hmm.
in, let's say, more careful study of the New Testament
Sure.
to realize that's just not right? You know,
That's a good question. I mean, I started following Christ very seriously as a teenager, and it was just one of those times in my life where I was just so hungry for anything, so I soaked up everything.
yeah, yeah,
And the filter doesn't set in until you begin, and I don't remember when it happened, but I just remember thinking, okay, you talk about the rapture and you say it's all over Revelation, but I just began asking questions like, okay,
mm,
where's that at? I mean, that's a simple question. And I don't know what got me to asking those questions, but I don't know. But when I began asking the questions, I found out that some of my teachers could not answer the questions.
yeah.
And that just set me on a different sort of journey.
Well, I probably was the same age.
Yeah.
I was in college,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
when I was in college, a long time before you were in college, Tim LaHaye, uh, late great planet Earth, Hal Lindsey's
Hal
book
Lindsey. Yeah.
was on every corner in the Zondervan bookstore in Grand Rapids. It was on the floor. They had thousands of copies hanging around.
Right.
Tim LaHaye wrote a commentary on Revelation with these weird
I know. Yeah.
pictures in it. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've heard of those, but
Oh yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think it's in print much. And then, but I was completely um, stripped of my understanding of Revelation because of Robert Gundry's book, The Church
Okay.
in the Tribulation.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And he wrote this book arguing carefully. And I really appreciated that because I was at an age where exegesis really mattered to me.
Mm,
And he proved a post-trib rapture to the, in the book of Revelation or whatever, in the New Testament.
yeah.
And that set me on a critical journey of subjecting my understanding of the future, of eschatology, of rapture, millennium, etc., on the basis of responsible exegesis in the context of the first century world. And the more I grew in my studies, I became more and more fascinated with Jewish studies,
Yeah.
Judaism,
Right.
and that just completely wrecked
Right.
my reading. And when my kids were in high school, it's really funny. My daughter read every volume in the Left Behind series, and she would say, "I don't believe any of it, but these are good stories." My son read some of them. I don't think he read them all,
Yeah.
but I gave them Bruce Metzger's. I think it's called Breaking the Code.
Sounds
It's
familiar. I've not
a
read it,
little
but
book, on Revelation,
hmm.
in which he just argues for a preterist view
Okay.
that the book is about the first century.
Hmm.
And my both of my children were both stunned by the book and totally convinced.
Okay. That's cool.
So
I'll have to check that book out. I've not read it.
yeah,
You
it's
know
a
what?
little 90-page book. Bruce Metzger,
Okay.
one of the greatest New Testament scholars
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
20th century.
So you know what? I just, as you were talking, I was thinking, I think one person who wrecked my reading of not just Revelation or eschatology, but the Bible was probably N.T. Wright.
Oh yeah,
I remember reading his, the New Testament and the People of God, one of those books back there.
yeah. I see it.
1992, back in the,
Yeah.
I didn't read it in 92, but that's when it was published. And I remember thinking, this has wrecked my hermeneutics forever. And it's just set me on a different trajectory. So yeah, and of course his emphasis on new creation, this embodied kind of Christianity
Yeah.
that really wrecked my escapist Christianity. That the
I was
rapture. Yeah.
I was teaching at Trinity,
Hmm.
Ted's.
Yeah.
At the time Tom Wright's book came out,
Mm.
1992. I think
Yeah, that's right.
in the fall of 92 or the fall of 93, somewhere in there, I gave lectures in my synoptic gospels class. I think the first day I gave a lecture on the story at work in Jesus.
Mm.
And it was kind of a summary of N.T. Wright's book. I'm not kidding you. It was the most dynamic class session I've ever had in my life because the students were totally captured, and I was just sort of channeling Tom Wright's vision
Yeah.
or his view. And I realized that Tom was doing something in that book that really mattered to a lot of people. And
Hmm.
it was something fresh and new. And I've never looked back. I mean,
Yeah.
Tom taught me a lot. I remember
Yeah.
when I wanted to have coffee with him, I was so intimidated that I hid, and he didn't know who he was looking for, and I was able to escape having. I was so intimidated by him. But
Yeah.
that Matt, that
Yeah.
was an amazing book to read,
Yeah.
and his Jesus book was like that for me too in
Mm.
'96.
Hmm.
The Resurrection book was good,
Hmm.
and the Paul book, of course, is his life's work. I see that in
Yeah,
your
that's over
shelf
there
back
too.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a book on Romans from as my PhD. It was published after I finished, and that going through Romans just very patiently and bit by bit was quite the exercise. But people like Tom Wright and others, of course, really helped me kind of navigate some of that. Yeah, one of these days we need to talk about Romans 5 because I've also read your was it the Adam Genome book? That was fun. That was a
Oh,
lot of fun.
yeah.
I love it. Yeah, it
Adam
was
and yeah, Adam
yeah,
and Eugene.
yeah, that was a good book too. So okay, so yeah, I want to talk to you about every book of the Bible, but we'll let's
Yeah.
I'll make our way back to Revelation because you mentioned something about repentance, and I think you might have even said the judgment word. So growing up, I know a lot of folks, many folks listening to this, maybe you, certainly me. I think I was afraid of God, right? And
Mhm.
Revelation provided the texts, right, for the
Yeah.
fear.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly, whether I'm preaching or teaching or whatever, I always, for some reason, maybe it's a calling on my life or something, but I want to help people rethink God, and I I want them to think of a Christological view of God. How does Revelation give us a Jesus picture of God? I'm thinking of like Romans 4 and 5, the lamb, the lion bit. Um,
Yeah,
could you comment on that and kind of
yeah,
link it to the judgment? Because Revelation, there's blood in Revelation, right? It
yeah,
seems heavy. So yeah, I got a lot of questions on that, and maybe we
yeah.
can chat about Greg Boyd's thesis about wrath at some point too. But anyway, whatever. That's a
I
lot
never
there.
could. I can never put together what Greg Boyd's doing. Okay. Um, let me say it this way to begin with,
Sure,
Matt. And I
sure.
don't think this is a complete answer. So this isn't some kind of uh, theory of explanation.
Hmm.
I don't think I don't think that God as judge in the book of Revelation is quite as important as people being able to be the judges of Rome and Babylon. In other words, the judgment of God is a message to the people of God that that place is going down because of their sinfulness.
Hmm.
And in a sense, it makes the people of God discerning dissidents of the way of Rome so that they can become, let's just use the word discernment,
Hmm.
which is going to be connected to the word judge in the New Testament, but we'll use two different English words. Um, it makes us capable of judging situations in the world, in the United States, in our state, in our village, as to how the powers are using their powers and whether they're using them for justice and peace or using them for power and exploitation.
Hmm.
And I think the book of Revelation does a lot about this. But the I like to look at the judgment scenes in the book of Revelation. I don't know if you agree with me on this, but I'm stuck now because it's in print. And that is, um, I
You can
like to
always
look at
publish retractions, by the way. Yeah,
that's right. I know, but nobody pays attention to them. And then
fair.
they say, "Oh, you change your mind all the time," like Clark Pinnock. Um, so to me, the I like to look at it in terms of fiction, like
Mm.
reading Tolkien, like reading C.S. Lewis. I have not read uh, what's it called, Harry Potter. I have not read a word of Harry Potter.
My
So
my wife is trying to
maybe
get me to read Harry Potter. I just don't have the time. She says
so
I'd
if
love it, so
so maybe all of that is in there as well.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's like Morris Sendak and Where the Wild Things Are that we read to our children when they were little.
Mm.
These are scary images of divine judgment, so that you and I will realize this is what happens to corrupted, sinful powers when they seize control and use them for murder and death and all this.
Hmm.
So, but at the same time, the flip image is, instead of the Roman Empire, instead of the goddess Roma and in Babylon, we have the woman of Revelation 12, which sort of like Mary and sort of like Israel and sort of like the church. And we have a lamb rather than a lion. And I don't know the issue. My graduate assistant at the time, Cody Matchett, he wrote the book. I said,
Hmm.
I think the lion morphs into the lamb. And he didn't like that idea of morphing. And I never did quite figure it out. It's like
Hmm.
two things rather than one becoming the other. But the lamb becomes the dominant image here of having being worthy to open up the scroll and the seals, etc., and to disperse these disciplines and judgments against the people in this world. And it becomes the lamb who is the image of Jesus in the book. And the lamb, yes, slaughters the enemies. In a fictional world, this is not a realistic world, but the lamb slaughters them with the word that comes out of its mouth. And all of a sudden you realize this is not a king with a
Hmm.
sword in his fist. This is, it's not Rome again, just a more powerful Rome.
Hmm.
It's a completely different form of warfare. And the believers, amazingly, conquer by the word of their testimony, by their
Right.
faithfulness in life, not by
Not with a blade.
weapons.
Right.
So yeah, so here we have, I think, an amazing image of Jesus who conquers in some of the most graphic images of defeat in the Bible, and yet it's not because of the slaughtering weapons of Rome, but
Sure.
by the testimony and the faithfulness of Christ as the Lamb.
Yeah.
So I'm a pacifist. So
Sure.
this book sort of haunts me at times. I don't like the images and what they can have as a effective history. You know what I mean by this in New
I do.
Testament scholarship?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
produces countries that think they can use weapons because they've got the Book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm. I feel like, and I wrote this in the little eschatology book that I finished up, and then in another place. If you look at the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, one thing that and I'm not the only one who says this, of course, but one thing I notice is that a lot of the cosmological language, the references to the like the sun, the stars, and everything like that, you have, if you compare that with Genesis, the sun and the stars were put in the sky for the benefit of Earth and the people on the Earth. But in Revelation, like the sun at one time scorches the earth, and it's like, it's almost like it's uncreation. And I'm curious if what you think about this. Is God's wrath more along the lines of just letting sin be sin and unfolding in on itself, as opposed to him actually doing anything? So, for example, I mean, I cut my theological teeth in the Reformed Baptist world, and it was all wrath was everywhere, right?
Yeah,
And it's honestly frightening in some sense, but I think actually Greg Boyd's book helped me on this a little bit, is to kind of to conceive of God's wrath as not as an extrinsic, like the extrinsic view where God, finds something wrathful on a shelf to pelt you with a sin that you committed over here, but actually wrath is inherent or intrinsic to the sin you commit. It's just, all wrath is just sin fully developed. And so does that capture Revelation's image of divine wrath, that it's just God removing his grace and creation's folding in on itself? What do you think about that?
I didn't grow up Reformed Baptist. My dad was Puritan in many ways, but and we were Baptist, but
Sure.
Calvinism wasn't that big of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came of age in atonement theory, when I was in college, I read Leon Morris's dissertation, Apostolic Preaching of the Cross, and he was really big on wrath, and he was fighting against C.H. Dodd, a professor, the Hulsian professor. And Dodd had argued that that wrath was unworthy of the God of the Bible, that it was Greco-Roman nonsense imposed on the New Testament. So Leon Morris did an apologetic defense of wrath. And Leon was such a kind person. And when I met him and we became friends, I guess I was able to tolerate wrath at the hands of Leon Morris. And then I read John Stott. But when I was working on atonement theory, I was very unsatisfied with propitiation as a model for the atonement, penal substitution. It's sometimes called, but I don't like to call it that. Propitiation is different than penal substitution, or it's a modification, a narrow. And I read A.T. Hansen, The Wrath of the Lamb. I don't think people read this book anymore, but he goes through the wrath passages in the Old Testament to prove exactly what you just asked.
Okay.
And his contention is that wrath is it's the unraveling of human nature, society, because of the presence of sin. So it's sort of an internal rather than an external thing.
Mm-hmm.
But Tom Wright, in his Romans commentary, makes it pretty clear that he thinks that if you take God out of wrath, you don't have it anymore. You want a God who will erase evil. And I think that happens in the book of Revelation very clearly. So, but wrath is something that God has built, has built into the system of creation. Mm-hmm. And that is therefore, God is an agent in wrath.
Yeah.
But we've got to get it away from God being pissed off, and just angry and just taking out his anger, like Bobby Knight coaching basketball, just mad all the time about something. and
Right.
just blowing up. That's not what wrath is. Wrath is a grievous mourning event for God, because he has seen his creation so distorted that it destroys itself. Sort of a C.S. Lewis idea as well, that
Sure.
sin eventually turns us into wraiths of diminished capacity to be what we were designed to be.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the language of God as an agent of wrath, because I don't want a God who doesn't get angry about things. This world
Yeah,
is crazy, and we need a God who gets angry, right?
yeah,
But yeah, like you, I don't want a God, and I don't think it doesn't matter what I want. I just don't think the Bible teaches that God is someone with thunderbolts looking for someone to strike at any
yeah,
given
yeah.
moment
That
either.
was that was what Dodd was fighting against.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, one way to conceive of it is like you said, I like how you put it. God built it into the system that maybe just given the metaphysics of it all, or the ontology of it all, of just the way goodness and evil as a privation of the good, that all God has to do is just remove his grace, and then the floods start, if
Yeah,
he withholds
yeah,
so he's an agent and he's doing something to bring wrath, but it's in anyway, there's a lot we could say about that, of course, but yeah,
yeah.
I like the way you put it. I do like the way you put it, and I think you and I are definitely kindred spirits on that point, because I think what your view of God is will obviously impact your view of yourself, and it could be very damaging, if you have.
Adolf Schlatter,
Mm-hmm.
auf Deutsch. Der erste Gedanke Jesu war der Gottesgedanke. The first thought of Jesus was thought about God.
Mm,
And I think that's right. And this was a big thing of A.W. Tozer, that what we think of God shapes all of our theology. But theology is not just thought. Theology is life.
right,
And
right.
so I think we have to connect the two.
So that brings me to a good point here, and get a couple more, few more, two or three more questions. And let's see, you in your book. I love this book because it's not theory only. It's not just exegesis in the traditional sense of, you know, you take us to the first century, but you don't leave us there, right? You
Yeah.
dedicate the book to Beth Allison Barr and Kristen Dumas, and those are names, of course, I'm sure everybody's familiar with. So let's kind of dive into the 21st century just a bit. What's going on now, and why is what is going on now important? Why do people need revelation today,
Yeah.
given these sorts of debates that we find ourselves in, especially with
Well,
like
you,
women in ministry? And I mean, there's so many
yeah.
things going on. Abuse, we've seen that a lot. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Well, you brought up that I like to read things backwards. Well, we did that with Romans. Revelation gets pretty close, but we weren't going to call this reading Revelation backwards. But Mark has to be read from the middle, so not the end. So right there in chapter 8. But I think it is the theo-political awareness
Mm-hmm.
of Babylon that provides Christians with, let's say, categories, hermeneutic, um, an awareness, a consciousness that the responsibility of a Christian who follows Jesus, who is the Lamb, is discernment of political corruption and sicknesses and systemic sins in the world. So to me, what we have to have, what we should come away from the book of Revelation is we are charged to do for our world what John did for his world. And
That's
that
good.
is to provide our audiences with a vision of the Lamb that is so piercing that we recognize the dragons when they appear on the scene.
Mm,
So that our awareness of what goodness is so clear that when we see evil, we recognize it immediately. And one of the things that has happened in the church today is we're dull. We're when it comes to discernment, we're dull. We're not perceiving exploitation. We're not perceiving racism. When I hear white Christians say that the United States does not have systemic racism, I just think that's willful blindness, because I grew up in a town that was split. On the other side of the river is where African Americans live. And when a family, a wonderful family, moved across and lived in the white neighborhood, they had a lot of money. They experienced all kinds of racism. My father was a coach, and I grew up with African American young men as my heroes. One of whom played for the Dallas Cowboys, Preston Pearson. He was a great football player. I think we need something is seriously wrong, and we need to have eyes that discern racism, that discern capitalism gone awry, that discerns sexism, that discerns churches that have no capacity to reach people in other communities. And I remember one time I was paid to be an advisor, a consultant for a church on the gospel and why they couldn't attract the Latin American community, the Mexican Americans in the community. And I said, because the gospel that you preach has no interest to the Mexican Americans in the United States now. And they looked like, no, we got the gospel right. It's the 4 spiritual laws. And I said, that is not what they're looking for. They're not looking for that sort of solution. And I think it was a naive blindness that needed to be made. They need to be aware of it, but they needed to repent and lament and spend all kinds of time listening, so that they would realize that what they were offering was actually a white gospel for white people who grew up in the suburbs and who were living a very comfortable life. And they didn't see the color of water that they were swimming in. And I think Revelation is the book that does this for us. And that's why we dedicated it to Beth and to Kristen, because they do fight against sexism in our culture and all kinds of isms. And they do so fearlessly and courageously, fiercely at times. And I think that's what John did. They're like John in our world today.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I think you mentioned gospel there. I think one reason we get Revelation wrong is because we just don't know the gospel, because we think gospel is justification by faith, and there's the kingdom element. I know you've written on that. Yeah, back in the day, I remember that, the King Jesus Gospel. That was great. And everybody go read the King Jesus Gospel too. It's a really good book, because you confront the misunderstanding about what gospel even is, and I think that we've become so comfortable with just reducing the gospel down to, going to heaven when you die, justification by faith alone, that kind of stuff. And we forgot the kingdom element. And when we forget the kingdom element, we don't even have a capacity at that point to critique rival empires and rival systems and rival institutions.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Okay, so let me I can hear somebody, I bet, pushing back just a little bit. Where you quote Revelation 13, someone's going to quote Romans 13. So how is John present a different vision with respect to the Christian's relationship to empire than, say, Paul does? Again, for those who are listening, there is some chatter about John and Paul, Revelation 13, Romans 13, where Paul seems to be more, I don't know how you would put it, on appearance, on the surface, seems to be more comfortable with empire than, say, John does in Revelation 13. What would you say to that?
Do you have people talking to you right now?
No, I really don't.
No, okay.
No.
Okay, so that's imagined. All right.
This is my attempt to play devil's advocate, is all.
Okay. Matt, this is a good question, but to me, it comes back to one of the things we've talked about, and that is context. Paul is in the city of Rome, or he's coming to the city of Rome. He's writing to the city of Rome, and he is concerned about, evidently, some kind of resistance going on in the city, I think, about taxes. All right. Now, you probably know more about Romans. You've probably forgotten more about Romans than I know, But I think that's part of what's going on there. And I think Peter in First Peter chapter 2, 17, whatever it is,
Yeah.
on through chapter 3, Peter is also working out the relationship between the church and the state, just beginning to explore. And both Paul and Peter, I think, have a certain pragmatism about them, that the mission is so important that we don't want to get ourselves in trouble so much that we don't do stupid things. So let's just try to stay under the radar and do good. Peter uses agathapoieo quite a bit, and that idea is public benevolence. So I think Peter had a strategy. I think Paul had a strategy so he could get on with the mission. John won't put up with that anymore, because John's beginning to experience something that Paul only experienced toward the end of his life. And I think the church has become a little bit more robust, a little bit more capable of handling itself. And they weren't just simply on mission as a meager minority, but they're still pretty small. And John has a completely different vision, that Rome is Babylon, and it's going to come down someday. And the opposition to the gospel, to the people who follow the Lamb and who put to death the Lamb, are going to go down in judgment, because this is not the way of God. So I would explain Paul, Romans 13, as the message of Paul for a given context at a given time, probably early in Nero's life, or reign, not his life. Had Paul written that letter 6 years later, he would never have said that about Rome, because Nero had started to turn, had gone against him. At least that's my dating of the book. Nero was, I think it's okay to say he was a first-class idiot. But John in Romans 13, or in Revelation 13, Revelation 12, whichever chapter you want to get into, is in a different context. And he's saying our best position is we have to resist the ways of Babylon. I think Paul would say, that's pretty good. I think we should resist it. But I don't write in such apocalyptic categories that you do. And so your images are starker and grander than mine. But I think Paul would sympathize with the importance of being dissident when Babylon begins to make its impact on the church.
That's good. Yeah, I don't think for a second that Paul would want to baptize Rome as the New Jerusalem, right? I think that would be a mistake. Is it fair to say, kind of along the, using something Jesus said as sort of a grid with respect to this question? Jesus said, you are in the world, but don't be of the world. Perhaps Paul is showing us how to be in the world in Romans 13, and then John is showing us how not to be of the world in Revelation 13. Is that a good way to put it?
I think that's good. Yeah. And I think that these authors are all trying, and these lines in the New Testament are complementary in a kaleidoscope of exploration and experimentation of how they're going to get along. I mean, remember this, Israel was a nation, is a temple state. All of a sudden now the church is going to become international. And now it's no longer protected by the temple. And by people who believe in the Old Testament, the covenant with God, that God made. So they're exploring how to live in this world. And at times, the best way to do it is to cooperate, and other times is to resist. So I like what you said there.
Last question here. What do you, if you could sit down with just any pastor, just a typical pastor today, what would you say that is number one for that pastor to resist and lead his congregation into resisting in our churches? And I'm talking about it in an American context, because different contexts might necessitate different conversations, but particularly in ours, in this day and age.
Well, the first thing I would tell pastors is spend careful time thinking of 5 things that you like about the United States as government, and 5 things you don't like. And have the courage to say both. And then when the things that we don't like, we have to learn to resist. Right. And even the things that we do like, freedom, that we don't overuse our freedom. Economic prosperity, that we don't overuse our economic prosperity. So I would say we have to become discerning agents. And this is not easy for pastors to do. I mean, I have a pastor now, Pastor Amanda. She is courageous politically, but our church is not made of a bunch of people who all think alike politically. We have people on both ends of the spectrum. And she's called to pastor all those people.
Right.
So we have to learn to use our language carefully, but I think if we show ourselves followers of Jesus first, and therefore we can appreciate what's good in the United States and also critique what's bad about the United States, over time, we develop a completely different theo-political discipleship that our churches in the United States need.
That's so good. Thank you so much. Everybody, the book is called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a Prophetic Call to Follow Jesus as a Dissident Disciple. Scott, thank you so much for hanging out and sharing your thoughts with us today.
Well, thank you. It's good to meet you, and that we're kindred spirits in some ways. I don't want to get you in too much trouble.
No. Hey, it's an honor to be a kindred spirit with you. So I really appreciate it, Scott.
Thank you.